Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Elliot Moss, Chair of B Midtown. That's the business improvement district that represents 420 businesses. We are the largest business improvement district in the UK, created with a mandate from businesses over 10 years ago. And our promise is to bring people and businesses of Midtown together to drive long-term sustainable, commercial and social growth. And this is all why we created the Midtown Big Ideas Exchange, and why I'm now able to welcome you to this, our 2017-18 series opening event. We're offering you over the course of the next 7 months insight, inspiration and stimulation. There'll be a different debate every month, and hopefully there's something for everybody. The topics are going to include tonight, of course, the future of London, Brexit, and I'm going to be introducing Jim Armitage in a moment as our chair. I think the timing for all of this is impeccable. All of us in our private capacities and our working ones are faced with the uncertainties and complexities that Brexit is bringing. Which is why I'm very happy to introduce Jim Armitage, City and Business Editor of the London Evening Standard, and he's our chair for tonight's discussion on the future of London, Brexit.
It's now 488 days and 20 hours, according to the internet, since the Brexit vote, where Britain voted 52% in favour of leaving the EU. 40.1% here in London. This much we know, yet we are still as far from knowing what Brexit is going to involve now than we were then, that shocking day on 23rd of June. What we do know is this: the UK now has the slowest growing economy in the G7, where before it had the fastest. The pound is down 15% against the dollar, 12% against the euro. Inflation, as a result, is running at 3%. Wages are stagnant. But what our panel of speakers are hopefully going to tell us tonight is how they view Brexit's impact on our economy, what they feel Brexit is going to look like come 2019 and beyond, and what can we as Londoners, whether we're running businesses or simply working in them or just trying to get by, what can we do about it? Is Brexit good or bad for London? It'll be interesting to see how the results mirror the results of the referendum now that we're in the state that we're in at the moment.
The emotions have run so high and the referendum was so divisive that I think it's impossible to be a fence-sitter anymore. We are still in this country leavers and remainers.
And my argument is not actually economic, although the economic case is compelling. My argument is mainly cultural, societal. I worked in New York for 5 years, and I went to America as a Brit, and I came back as a European, because exposure to the US culture made one realize the common values that unite Europe. And that's where I want to be, that's where I want my children to be, and that's where I think this country should be.
I voted in 1975, before most of this audience was born. I voted when we voted 2-1 to join the common market, to remain in the common market. Remember, we had already joined. Harold Wilson called that referendum, and Harold Wilson was a very slippery customer. Harold Wilson made Blair and Mandelson look like a combination of Abe Lincoln and Socrates. And that's hard to do. But he said we need to look hard at the terms, and we will offer the British people a referendum on the terms. Well, our Parliament has yet to evaluate the terms of departure, which I think will be seen to be dire. This is an economy more dependent on foreign investment than any other large economy in history. I think if Parliament does decide to leave, I think it will be dire in its consequences, not just for our economy, but for the sort of society and people we should want to be. Open, tolerant, liberal, embracing diverse cultures. That is the kind of country I want to go on living in. I want my children to live in.
There is still a problem that Britain wants to have its cake and eat it. We want to be able, the Boris Johnsons of the world, the Liam Foxes of this world, want to be able to import, growth hormone infused beef from the US and still, sell our own stuff to France. And there's an impasse. I think agriculture is a real problem still at the negotiation table as we speak.
I think the thing is so absurd, and the talks will get nowhere, and the government will fall before the end of the period, and we will have a Corbyn-led government which will put the whole thing on ice.
Because somebody making a speech just before the referendum said this: the reality is we don't know on what terms we'd win access to the single market. We do know that in a negotiation we would need to make concessions in order to access it, and those concessions could well be about accepting EU regulations over which we would have no say, making financial contributions as we do now, accepting free movement rules just as we do now, or quite possibly all three combined. It's not clear why other EU member states would give Britain a better deal than they themselves enjoy. Now that sounds blindingly obvious, and that's what Theresa May said just before the referendum. The idea that we're going to have privileged access to this club, having decided to leave, is just, I have to say, it's mendacious, because nobody can believe that.
I don't believe that trade is about trade deals. I believe trade is having something that people want to buy off you. And that's the UK's problem, that it does not actually make enough of the stuff people want to buy, and it is utterly disorganized in the way it supports those who want to export.
Michael Bloomberg's been here opening a big building and centre, and he said he didn't believe any nation could be quite this stupid. And it's the most stupid thing any country's ever done, apart from Trump. And I think we can all agree that electing Trump sets a benchmark that's very hard to beat. But he's right. The EU's on the brink of a capital markets directive, talking of digital market integration. We've talked about services. Very difficult, but at least we're talking about it. Talking about energy deregulation. All of those work for London and the UK. And just back to the vote. In the vote, all the polling after the event, over 70% of the under 25s voted to remain, over 60% of the under 35s. Your future is being taken away from you by largely old men, and I don't think you have to take it. There should now be mass movements against this catastrophe.
Are you saying we should be out on the streets?
Yes, we should. I was on the streets in 1968.
I am, yeah.
I was out on the street during the Remain campaign. This is your future. This is almost irreversible. There's some early signs that opinion among leavers is beginning to move to a regret. Only early signs. But this game isn't over, and we don't know the terms of departure.
London has weathered huge events before, huge changes before, as have many cities around the world. I think it has succeeded by not having revolutions, by accepting those changes, reforming slowly, and that has always been the British way, not chopping anyone's heads off. I think one of the best articles that was actually written on the sort of cultural and aesthetic nature of Brexit was actually in the Financial Times, not financial at all. It was by Fred Studeman about the experience of being in Berlin just before reunification, when every lawyer in Germany was sitting down trying to work out how you could possibly reunify these two now very, very different systems, West Germany, East Germany, and no one thought it could happen. No one thought that you could bring the mark together again, reimpose a single currency. And you know what? It happened. And Germany survived, and it grew again. There are always things that we think are impossible. Now, I'm not going to sit over here and say that Brexit is a good thing. I think it's a terrible thing. But we survive extraordinary things. What makes it harder is when people go on the streets and burn things.
What we're suggesting to clients is treat Brexit like as a business risk. That's what it is, a business risk, and start looking at it. So examine some scenarios. Look at it. The easiest way to plan for it will be a scenario of most change, and then see what it does for your business. What does it do about the regulatory environment in which you work? What does it do about the access to the labour that you need to execute business? Tariff barriers, those sorts of things.
That sounds great in principle, but we've got no idea. So how can you prepare for something that...
Well, that's why I suggest you start with a position of most change.
So the worst plan for the worst case scenario.
Look at a most extreme position, and then say, right, okay, if for Labour we would need to do X or Y, fine, we know what the position of most change is. Any change less than that, you will be well prepared. And I think some businesses will need to make some changes potentially quite soon. Others, it might be more into the medium term. But we are seeing businesses begin to plan around this.
So I think the issue is really with the thousands of small businesses that depend on the 3 million EU immigrants who are here. 15% of teachers in London are EU, not British. The catering industry in London is 60% non-British. The National Health Service, as many have said, is of the order of 15 to 20%, depending on which skill you have. Now, how are these organizations actually going to function if they are denied that labor? There's already the beginnings of a drift home because people do not feel welcome for obvious reasons. All these things are going to grind to a halt, and that's where the issue is. It's not really with a Glaxo or a Vodafone or whatever, because at the end of the day, they'll just shift their operations overseas if it hurts. It's the people who can't move, who are small businesses here, and are the lifeblood of London, actually. They're the ones who are going to suffer from this.
Foreign-owned companies are 20% of all our jobs. 37% of all business turnover in Britain is from foreign-owned companies. Now, they don't have intrinsic loyalty here. And a figure that's even more alarming, this is recent ONS data from about a month ago, they are 74% more productive than UK-owned businesses. So they've tended to bring not only capital, but talent and technology and global best practice into our economies. When we lose that, as we will, the impact on the productivity problem that's been touched on can only be negative. Being a member of the EU and the coils and toils of being a member of the world's largest integrated single market, I'm quoting Boris again there, doesn't seem to inhibit Germans running up a surplus of over 8% while we're running a deficit of 5%.
I wish Boris was here, actually. I think he'd better counter you better than I would. But David...
The idea that we're suddenly going to have global champions to replace the market on our doorstep is just nonsense on stilts.
A lot of the intellectual ferment of our universities and a lot of the intellectual ferment of things like the fintech sector is born of the diversity of people from different backgrounds, which currently works. But the moment you start banging on curbs on immigration and stopping people moving normally, you bring that to a halt. I mean, free movement defines modern business. It isn't a nice to have. It's what modern business is. And to decide that you're going to quarantine that, as our current government seems to think is possible, is utterly absurd. It shows a complete lack of understanding of what makes the economy tick.
I mean, London's great success has been that it's always been open. It's always been able to attract the best from all over the world in all kinds of fields, and we've been open and tolerant. And if we lose that essential part of our DNA in London, we will lose something that's almost impossible to recapture. After all, this city was named by Romans 2,000 years ago. It took another 1,000 years for Normans to come in and civilize us.
My hope, frankly, is that the EU falls apart sufficiently quickly under the strain of the migration crisis, which I believe it may well do, that we are missing out on a successful club less than we might fear right now.
We've got the polls through from the people who've been watching this while we've been on. 20% good, 80% bad. So if that is a reflection of London as a whole, that clearly shows that Londoners are far more pro-Remain than they were even at the time of the referendum. Unless our rather one-sided panel here has persuaded them otherwise this evening, that's quite telling.